If you've been to New York City, you've probably noticed that it's home to a few different waterways. Waterways like the Hudson River, New York Harbor, the Harlem River, and the East River, each having their own unique histories. The focus of this video will be the East River. It runs between Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn to the southwest, and then to the northeast it cuts through the boroughs of Queens and the Bronx. It may just seem like some body of water, deserving nothing beyond an initial thought, but the East River has quite a few dark stories connected to it. And the story that will be covered in this video will be the tragic story of the General Slocum steamboat disaster in the summer of 1904. A disaster so awful that it was considered the worst maritime disaster of the 20th century until the Titanic surpassed it 8 years later in 1912. General Slocum worked as a passenger ship taking people on excursions around New York City. She was owned by the Knickerbocker Company and was named after the Union Civil War general and New York Congressman Henry Warner Slocum. On Wednesday, June 15, 1904, the ship had been chartered for $350 by St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church in the Little Germany district of Manhattan. This was an annual rite for the group, which had made the trip for 17 consecutive years, a period when German settlers moved from Little Germany to the Upper East and West sides. Nearly 1,400 passengers, mostly women and children, boarded General Slocum, which was to sail up the East River and then eastward across the Long Island Sound to Locust Grove, a picnic site in Eaton's Neck, Long Island. The ship got underway from the Recreation Pier at 3rd Street on the East River at 9:30 a.m. It passed west of Blackwell Island, now Roosevelt Island, and turned east, remaining south of Ward's Island. As it was passing East 90th Street, a fire started in the forward cabin or lamp room, the third compartment aft from the bow under the main deck. The fire was possibly caused by a discarded cigarette or match. The disastrous fire was fueled by the straw, oily rags, and lamp oil strewn around the room. The first notice of a fire was at 10 in the morning. Eyewitnesses claimed the initial blaze began in various locations, including a paint locker filled with flammable liquids and a cabin filled with gasoline. Passengers on the main deck were aware of the fire at the entrance to Hell Gate. Captain Van Schaik was not notified until 10 minutes after the fire was discovered. A 12-year-old boy had tried to warn him earlier, but was not believed. After he was notified of the fire, Van Schaik ordered full speed ahead. Approximately 30 seconds later, he directed the pilot to beach the ship on North Brother Island. Following this last command, Van Schaik descended to the hurricane deck and remained there until he was able to jump into shallow water after the ship was beached. Although the captain was ultimately responsible for the safety of passengers, the owners had made no effort to maintain or replace the ship's safety equipment. The main deck was equipped with a standpipe connected to a steam pump, but the fire hose attached to the forward end of the standpipe, a 100-foot length of cheap unlined linen, had been allowed to rot and burst in several places. When the crew tried to put out the fire, they were unable to attach a rubber hose because the coupling of the linen hose remained attached to the standpipe. The ship was also equipped with hand pumps and buckets, but they were not used during the disaster. The crew gave up firefighting efforts after failing to attach the rubber hose. Survivors reported that the life preservers were useless and fell apart in their hands, while desperate mothers placed life jackets on their children and tossed them into the water, only to watch in horror as their children sank instead of floating. Most of those on board were women and children who, like most Americans of the time, could not swim. Victims found that their heavy wool clothing absorbed water and weighed them down in the river. It was discovered that Non-Pareil Cork Works, supplier of cork materials to manufacturers of life preservers, placed 8-ounce iron bars inside the cork materials to meet minimum content requirements at the time. Many of the life preservers had been filled with cheap and less effective granulated cork and brought up to proper weight by the inclusion of the iron weights. Canvas covers rotted with age, split and scattered the powdered cork. Managers of the company, Non-Pareil Cork Works, were indicted but not convicted. The life preservers on the Slocum had been manufactured in 1891 and had hung above the deck, unprotected from the elements, for 13 years. Captain Van Schaik decided to continue his course rather than run the ship aground or stop at a nearby landing. By going into headwinds and failing to immediately ground the ship, he fanned the fire and promoted its spread from fore to aft. The investigating commission later faulted Van Schaik for passing up opportunities to beach the vessel in Little Hellgate, west of the Sunken Meadows, or the Bronx Bills, east of the Sunken Meadows, which also would have put the prevailing winds astern, keeping flames from spreading along the length of the ship. Van Schaik later argued he was trying to avoid having the fire spread to riverside buildings and oil tanks. Flammable paint also helped the fire spread out of control, which was driven aft, mainly along the port side of the ship. Passengers who were on the upper promenade and hurricane decks were forced into the aft starboard quarter. 10 minutes after the ship was beached, the fire had essentially engulfed the vessel. No more than 20 minutes had elapsed since the first flames came up from the lamp room. Some passengers jumped into the river to escape the fire, but the heavy women's clothing of the day made swimming almost impossible and dragged them underwater to drown. An estimated 100 to 500 died when the overloaded starboard section of the hurricane deck collapsed, casting those passengers into deep water, and others were battered by the still turning paddles as they tried to escape into the water or over the sides. The commission estimated that 400 to 600 people drowned after the ship was beached, as they jumped off the aft portion of the boat into deep water. Those jumping off the bow landed in shallower water. The General Slocum remained beached on North Brother Island for approximately 90 minutes before breaking free and drifting east for approximately 1 mile. By the time she sank in shallow water off the Bronx shore at Hunts Point, an estimated 1,021 people, including 2 of the 30 crew members, had either burned to death or drowned. There were 431 survivors. The actions of 2 tugboats, which arrived a few minutes after the Slocum was beached, were credited with saving between 200 and 350 people. Captain Van Schaik lost sight in one eye owing to the fire. Reports indicate that Captain Van Schaik deserted the General Slocum as soon as it settled, jumping into a nearby tug, along with several crew. The captain was hospitalized at Lebanon Hospital. On that fateful day, many acts of heroism were committed by the passengers, witnesses, and emergency personnel. Staff and patients from the hospital on North Brother Island participated in the rescue efforts, forming human chains and pulling victims from the water. In the aftermath, 8 people were indicted by a federal grand jury after the disaster: the captain, 2 inspectors, and the president, secretary, treasurer, and commodore of the Knickerbocker Steamship Company. Most boatmen felt that Captain Van Schaik was unjustly made a scapegoat for the resulting tragedy. Instead of the owners of the steamer or the effectiveness of the life-saving and firefighting equipment then required, and the inspections of it by government inspectors, he was the only person convicted. The captain was ultimately found guilty on one of 3 charges: criminal negligence, for failing to maintain proper fire drills and fire extinguishers. The jury could not reach a verdict on the other 2 counts of manslaughter and was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. He spent 3 years and 6 months at Sing Sing prison before he was paroled. President Theodore Roosevelt declined to pardon Van Schaik, but the captain was finally released when the Federal Parole Board under President Taft's administration voted to free him on August 26, 1911. Captain Van Schaik died in 1927 and is buried at Oakwood Cemetery in Troy, New York. The Knickerbocker Steamship Company, which owned the ship, paid a relatively small fine despite evidence that they might have falsified inspection records. The disaster motivated federal and state regulation to improve the emergency equipment on passenger ships. The neighborhood of Little Germany, which had been in decline for some time before the disaster as residents moved uptown, almost disappeared afterward. With the trauma and arguments that followed the tragedy and the loss of many prominent settlers, most of the Lutheran Germans remaining in the Lower East Side eventually moved uptown. The church whose congregation chartered the ship for the fateful voyage was converted to a synagogue in 1940 after the area was settled by Jewish residents. The victims were interred in cemeteries around New York, with 58 identified victims buried in the cemetery of the Evergreens and 46 identified victims buried in Greenwood Cemetery, both in Brooklyn. Many victims were buried at Lutheran Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens, now Lutheran All Faiths Cemetery, where there's still an annual memorial ceremony held every year. The General Slocum steamship disaster is just one of the dark tales surrounding the East River. In the next video, we will be covering the dark history of the North Brother Island. If you remember back in the video, North Brother Island was the very island that the General Slocum was initially marooned on before drifting away. On top of being connected to the General Slocum disaster, North Brother Island has its own dark legacy apart from the story you just heard, because it was the site of a hospital previously alluded to before in the video. In this hospital resided a very malicious woman, who you might have heard about before. A woman named Mary Mallon, also infamously known as Typhoid Mary. The next video will detail her dark antics and the contributing stain she left on the legacy of North Brother Island. And with that said, make sure to like and subscribe to stay up to date with the content. Thanks for watching.